On December 10th, which ironically was Human Rights Day, the United States became essentially the only country to formally recognize Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara, the former Spanish colony forcibly seized by Moroccan forces back in 1975. Trump's proclamation is directly counter to a series of United Nations Security Council resolutions and a landmark World Court ruling calling for self-determination. Trump's decision was a quid pro quo, a reward for Morocco's formal recognition of Israel, a country which is also an occupying power. Trump had previously broken precedent by recognizing Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights and of greater East Jerusalem. But in the case of Western Sahara, the United States has recognized the annexation of an entire country, a country which has been recognized as an independent state by no less than 80 other nations. So this is a particularly dangerous precedent. Western Sahara is a full member of the African Union, formerly known as the Organization for African Unity, the charter of which forbids any unilateral changes of borders, no matter how arbitrary they may have been. And so in effect, Trump has recognized the takeover of one African country by another. And as with his early recognition of Israel's conquests, Trump is effectively renouncing the long-standing international legal principles of self-determination in favor of the right of conquest. I mean, it's ironic, this prohibition of such territorial conquest enshrined in the UN Charter, which is what led the U.S. to insist we had to launch the Gulf War in 1991 to reverse Iraq's conquest to Kuwait. Now the U.S. is essentially saying that an Arab country invading and annexing its small southern neighbor is okay after all, as long as that neighbor is an ally. Trump cites Morocco's autonomy plan for the territory as the only basis for a just and lasting solution, even though it falls far short of the international legal definition of autonomy. It would in effect just continue the occupation. Human Rights Watch, which just came out with a new report today, along with Amnesty International and other human rights groups, have documented the Moroccan occupation forces' widespread suppression of peaceful advocates of independence, which raises serious questions about what autonomy under the kingdom would actually look like. Freedom House has listed Western Sahara as among the worst of the worst human rights situations in the world, along with North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and Tibet. So we're talking really bad. In fact, I've been to at least 80 countries at this point, including Iraq under Saddam and Indonesia under Suharto. And I've never seen a worse police state than Moroccan occupied Western Sahara. They were supposed to get independence from Spain in 1975. Instead, Morocco seized the territory with the support of the US that didn't want to see the leftist Polisario Front, the National Liberation Struggle, come to power. They waged a war continued until 1991, when a ceasefire agreement came into effect in return for an act of legitimate self-determination. This is a non-self-governing territory, remember. This is, in fact, a colony. And all colonies have the right of self-determination, which necessarily includes the option of independence. But Morocco refused to go ahead with the referendum. And as with Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, basically the aggressor had powerful friends on the UN Security Council, which blocked the UN from enforcing its recognition. There's been an oppressive nonviolent struggle inside the occupied territory, brutally suppressed, but the other reason it hasn't gotten very far is that Morocco has colonized the area. They now, about 40% of the Sahrawi population are in refugee camps in Algeria under Polisario administration. But the remaining 60% inside Western Sahara are now outnumbered like 3 to 1 by Moroccan settlers. And as with the Israeli settlers in the West Bank, this is a direct violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits countries from moving civilian populations onto territories seized by military force. Disturbingly, within hours of Trump's announcement, the word came that the decision to sell 4 sophisticated large aerial drones to Morocco, part of this $1 billion arms deal. And the concern is that the Polisario, after 29 years of frustration, of complete ongoing violations of the ceasefire by Morocco, refusal to go ahead with the referendum, brutal suppression in the occupied territories, Polisario resumed the arms struggle just last month. And so many people are concerned that this arms sale is part of U.S. effort to re-engage in the counterinsurgency war. And now the U.S. as a secessionist movement within Moroccan territory, as opposed to a war of aggression in an occupied country. Legally, it gives the United States much more leeway in terms of directly supporting the counterinsurgency movement. Now, once he becomes president, Biden could reverse Trump's recognition simply with the stroke of a pen. But because it's tied to Morocco's recognition of Israel, Biden's going to be under a lot of pressure, because if he rescinds it, Morocco would likely renounce its recognition. And so there's a lot of pressure among supporters of Israel that Biden not do that. But it's very important, I would argue, that Biden make this a priority, because and that in many ways, one could argue that self-determination is one of the most basic of human rights. If the United States and Morocco get away with international recognition of this annexation, which is clearly their goal, it would be the first time since the signing of the United Nations Charter that a country has gotten away with expanding its territory by force. It'd be the only case of an incomplete decolonization, where a colonized people are denied their right to self-determination, which again requires requires an act of true self-determination. And the reason, of course, the Moroccans don't want to go ahead with a referendum is that the Sahrawi people would almost certainly vote in favor of independence. The United Nations delegation as far back as 1975 noted there was overwhelming support for independence under the leadership of Polisario, not incorporated into Morocco. The Sahrawis, that's the name of the people in Western Sahara, who have a distinct history, a distinct dialect, Hassaniya, which is very different than the Arabic spoken in Morocco and northern Algeria, distinct dress and food. They've also historically been a nomadic people. They've always been a free people. They've never lived under a sultan or an emir. They were never part of the Ottoman Empire. And so the idea of living under a centralized state, like Morocco has been for centuries, especially an authoritarian one, is not something that they want. And the cultural differences are real too, particularly in the rights of women. Women in Sahrawi society have equal rights to inheritance and divorce. They keep their maiden names. The leaders of the nonviolent resistance movement inside the occupied territory, Aminatu Haidar is the most prominent one. She's won the human rights awards from the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights, from the Russell Train Foundation, from various European groups. She's been nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize. And the fact that she and other Sahrawi women are so much in the leadership, they've been particularly targeted by the Moroccan regime for torture, including sexual torture, because they're considered kind of uppity by Moroccan standards. And the irony, of course, is that in the United States, we're always hearing about why don't Arab countries have more pluralism and more democracy and be more secular and have more rights for women. Well, that's what the Sahrawis are trying to do. They're trying to have a state that is based on these values, and yet the United States instead is backing this authoritarian regime and its this illegal irredentism, this conquest, this occupation. And that's why I really hope that those in the human rights community will take the opportunity that this rare time that people have been paying attention to Western Sahara because of Trump's announcement, to mobilize and make this an issue, because human rights are definitely worth the fight.